In 1097 AD, high in the frozen limestone mountains of the Maestrazgo, a silver-armored knight stood at the base of a vertical fortress that seemed to pierce the sky itself, and our good knight was about to storm the key to the north in a siege that would decide whether El Cid's fragile kingdom would survive or crumble into the Almoravid darkness. As Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the legendary Campeador, led his battle-hardened mesnada against the impregnable rock of Morella, this wasn't just another castle siege. It was the desperate gambit to sever the Almoravid supply lines, secure the vital corridor to Aragon, and avenge the death of El Cid's only son at Consuegra just months before. Watch as our immortal good knight climbs the killing slopes of the Mola, fights house to house through tiered streets raining arrows and boiling pitch, and witnesses the moment when Christian steel finally broke the Almoravid stranglehold on the northern frontier. From the brutal vertical warfare that turned limestone cliffs into rivers of blood, to the final desperate stand atop the citadel where the last defenders fought to the death, every moment of this epic tale forged the keys to the kingdom of Valencia. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's most brutal sieges, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which siege or battle you'd like the good knight to survive next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that frozen winter of 1097, when a single fortress held the fate of an entire kingdom. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver and Grief. The wind cut like a Saracen blade across the high plateau of the Maestrazgo. It was the kind of cold that found every gap in armor, every weakness in resolve. The good knight stood motionless on a ridge overlooking the valley, his silver mail catching the pale November light. The armor was heavy, 25 kilograms of interlocking rings that had saved his life 100 times and threatened to crush him 1,000 more. Each breath came shallow in the thin mountain air, a white mist that vanished into the grey sky. Below, the army of El Cid snaked through the narrow pass like a steel serpent. Thousands of men, horses, siege engines and supply wagons crawled upward through the ancient Roman roads that had been carved into the limestone centuries before. The sound was a low rumble, hooves on stone, the creak of leather, the rattle of weapons, and the occasional shout of a sergeant keeping the column moving. The good knight had marched with this army for over a decade. He knew its rhythms, its moods, its capacity for both glory and horror. But something had changed. The army that had left Valencia weeks ago was not the same army that now climbed toward Morella. The shadow of Consuegra hung over every man. The good knight had not been at that battle. He had been with the southern column, fighting at Bayren. But the news had reached them like a plague. Diego Rodriguez, El Cid's only son, the heir to the Principality of Valencia, had been killed. Cut down by Almoravid cavalry in the dust of central Spain while fighting alongside King Alfonso VI. The good knight had known Diego, a young man, barely 20, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legend. Now he was gone, and with him the future of the Cidian dynasty. The good knight had seen Rodrigo Díaz after the news arrived. The Campeador had not wept. He had not raged. He had simply grown colder, harder, like the limestone cliffs they now approached. The war had become something else. It was no longer about building a kingdom to pass to a son. It was about legacy, about proving that Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar had carved something permanent into the flesh of history, even if there was no one to inherit it. The good knight understood this. He had no sons either, no family waiting in some distant village. His family was the mesnada, The brotherhood of knights and soldiers who had followed El Cid through exile, through triumph, through the endless grinding war of the Reconquista. And now, that family was marching toward a fortress that looked like it had been built by God to be unconquerable. Morella. Even from this distance, the fortress dominated the horizon. It sat atop a massive limestone butte, a geological freak that rose vertically from the surrounding valleys like a stone tooth. The locals called it the Mola. The GoodKnight thought it looked like a clenched fist raised against heaven. The town clung to the lower slopes, a maze of narrow streets and stone houses, but the citadel itself crowned the summit, over 1,000 meters above sea level. Sheer cliffs formed natural walls on 3 sides. The only approach was a winding, exposed path that forced attackers into a narrow file, perfect for slaughter. The GoodKnight had stormed castles before. He had fought at Cabra, where El Cid had humiliated the Count of Barcelona. He had been at the siege of Valencia itself, the great prize that had made Rodrigo a prince. But Morella was different. Morella was not a city on a plain. It was a vertical nightmare, a fortress designed by terrain itself. And yet it had to fall. The strategic logic was clear, even to a simple knight. Morella controlled the northern corridor between Valencia and Aragon. It sat astride the mountain passes that connected the coastal plains to the Ebro Valley. As long as the Almoravids held Morella, they could cut the supply lines from Peter Frumitst of Aragon, El Cid's only reliable ally. They could threaten the northern frontier of Valencia, forcing Rodrigo to fight on 2 fronts. Worse, Morella served as a staging ground for Almoravid raids. From its heights, enemy scouts could watch the movements of the Scythian army and send word to the garrisons in Zaragoza and Tortosa. The GoodKnight had heard the war council. He had stood in the back of the tent, silent as always, while El Cid and his captains debated the campaign. The victory at Byron had been decisive. The Almoravid field army shattered, their commander fleeing into the sea. But Byron had only secured the south. The north remained a dagger pointed at Valencia's heart. "We take Morella," El Cid had said, his voice flat and cold. "We take it, and we burn their supply lines. We take it, and we show the Almoravids that there is no fortress in Spain they can hold against us." No one had argued. The Campeador's word was law, and so the army had turned north, leaving the warm coast behind and climbing into the frozen highlands of the Maestrazgo. The march had been brutal. The roads were little more than mule tracks, winding through deep ravines and jagged ridges. The weather had turned against them. Freezing rain had soaked through cloaks and gambesons, turning the mail into a second skin of ice. Horses had slipped on the wet limestone, breaking legs and necks. Men had fallen sick, coughing blood into the cold air. The GoodKnight's own armor had begun to rust, the silver sheen dulled by moisture and grime. But they had kept moving, because that was what soldiers did. They marched, and they fought, and they died. And the ones who survived marched again. The GoodKnight turned his gaze back to Morella. Smoke rose from the town, cooking fires, forges, the daily life of a garrison preparing for siege. He wondered how many men were up there. 1,000? 2,000? It didn't matter. The fortress itself was the true enemy. Stone and gravity, and the thin, freezing air. A voice broke his reverie. "Admiring the view, GoodKnight?" The GoodKnight turned. It was Alvar Fañez, El Cid's right hand, his most trusted captain. Alvar was older than the GoodKnight, his beard streaked with grey, his face a map of scars. He had been with Rodrigo since the beginning, since the exile from Castile, since the desperate years when they had been little more than mercenaries fighting for Moorish kings. The GoodKnight nodded toward Morella. "It's a long way up," Alvar grunted. "Aye, and a longer way down if you fall." He squinted at the fortress. "But we've taken worse." The GoodKnight wasn't sure that was true, but he didn't argue. Alvar had a way of making the impossible sound routine. "The Campeador wants the siege lines established by nightfall," Alvar continued. "We'll camp on the heights to the east, out of range of their artillery. The Aragonese will take the western approaches, cut the road to Alcaniz. No one gets in or out. And then?" Alvar's smile was grim. "And then we starve them. Or we storm them, whichever comes first." The GoodKnight looked back at the molar. The wind howled through the pass, carrying the scent of snow. Winter was coming, and they were about to lay siege to a fortress in the mountains. Men would freeze, men would die of disease, and when the assault finally came, men would die on those walls. But the GoodKnight would not. He never did. He had survived Cabra and Valencia and Byron. He had survived a decade of war. He would survive Morella. He had to, because if he didn't, who would remember? Chapter 2. The encirclement, the army of El Cid moved like a living organism, spreading across the valleys and ridges surrounding Morella with practiced efficiency. The GoodKnight rode with the vanguard, his destrier picking its way carefully over the loose scree. The horse was a veteran, like its rider, scarred, patient, and utterly unflappable. It had carried the GoodKnight through the chaos of Byron, where the Almoravid lines had broken like waves against a cliff. Now it carried him toward a different kind of battle. The siege camp was taking shape on a plateau to the east of the mola. It was a good position, high ground, with clear sightlines to the fortress and the surrounding valleys. The engineers had already begun marking out the perimeter, driving stakes into the frozen earth to delineate the boundaries of the camp. Tents were going up in orderly rows, organized by company and function. The heavy cavalry, the caballeros like the GoodKnight, had their section near the center, close to El Cid's command tent. The infantry and crossbowmen were arrayed in concentric rings, forming a defensive perimeter in case the Almoravids attempted a sally. The GoodKnight dismounted and handed his reins to a squire. The boy was young, maybe 14, with wide eyes and a nervous energy. He had joined the mesnada after Byron, eager for glory. The GoodKnight wondered how long that eagerness would last. A week? A month? The first time he saw a friend's guts spilled on the ground? The GoodKnight said nothing. He had learned long ago that words were useless. Experience was the only teacher that mattered. He walked through the camp, his silver armor drawing glances from the common soldiers. They knew him, or at least they knew of him. The knight in the shining mail who never seemed to die. Some thought he was blessed. Others thought he was cursed. The GoodKnight didn't care what they thought. He cared about the weight of his sword, the fit of his armor, and the ground beneath his feet. The command tent was larger than the others, a canvas pavilion reinforced with wooden poles. Guards stood at the entrance, hard-eyed men with spears and the look of veterans. They nodded as the GoodKnight approached and pulled back the flap. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and the faint tang of wine. A large table dominated the center of the tent, covered with maps and parchment. El Cid stood at the head of the table, his hands braced on the wood, his eyes fixed on a crude sketch of Morella. He looked older than the GoodKnight remembered. The grey in his beard had spread, and there were new lines around his eyes. The death of Diego had aged him. Around the table stood the captains of the mesnada. Alvar Fañez was there, of course, along with Pero Bermudez, the standard-bearer, and Martin Antolines, the quartermaster. There were also several Aragonese lords, vassals of Peter I, who had brought their own contingents to the siege. They wore different armor, different colors, but their faces all held the same expression, grim determination mixed with a healthy dose of fear. El Cid looked up as the GoodKnight entered. For a moment, their eyes met. The Campeador's gaze was cold, calculating, the look of a man who had long since stopped counting the cost of victory. "GoodKnight," El Cid said. His voice was hoarse, roughened by years of shouting orders over the din of battle. "You'll ride with Alvar tomorrow. We're sealing the northern passes." The GoodKnight nodded. He didn't need to ask why. The northern passes were the lifeline to Zaragoza and Tortosa, the nearest Almoravid strongholds. If a relief force was going to come, it would come from the north. Cutting those passes meant isolating Morella, turning the siege into a slow strangulation. Alvar stepped forward, pointing to the map. "There are 3 main routes: the pass at Torre Miro, the road through Carol, and the valley approach from Alcaniz. We'll need cavalry patrols on all 3. Fast, mobile, ready to fall back if they encounter a superior force." One of the Aragonese lords, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, frowned. "And if the Almoravids send a full army, we can't hold 3 passes with cavalry alone." "We won't have to," El Cid said. "If they send a full army, we'll know days in advance. The scouts will give us warning. We'll consolidate, meet them in the field if necessary." He paused, his gaze sweeping the tent. "But I don't think they will. The Almoravids are stretched thin. They're fighting Alfonso in the north, and they've just lost an army at Byron. They don't have the manpower to relieve every garrison." The GoodKnight thought about that. It made sense, strategically. But strategy was a cold comfort when you were standing on a frozen ridge, watching for enemy banners on the horizon. The meeting continued, the captains discussing logistics, food supplies, fodder for the horses, the construction of siege engines. The GoodKnight listened with half an ear. He had heard it all before. Sieges were as much about patience as violence. You built your camp, you cut the enemy's supplies, you waited for hunger and disease to do the work, and when the time was right, you stormed the walls and finished it. But Morella was different. The mola was too steep for traditional siege tactics. Battering rams were useless against sheer cliffs. Siege towers couldn't be wheeled up vertical rock. The only way to take Morella was to starve it out or to climb it, step by bloody step. The GoodKnight suspected it would be the latter. The next morning, the GoodKnight rode out with Alvar Fañez and a company of 50 cavalry. The sun was a pale disk behind the clouds, offering no warmth. The wind had picked up overnight, and it carried the promise of snow. The GoodKnight's breath misted in the air, and his fingers were numb inside his gauntlets despite the wool lining. They rode north, following a narrow track that wound through a forest of stunted pines. The trees were twisted and gnarled, shaped by the relentless wind. The ground was rocky, covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under the horses' hooves. The GoodKnight rode near the front, his eyes scanning the ridges for movement. This was hostile country. Every shadow could hide an Almoravid scout. Every bend in the trail could be an ambush. But the morning passed without incident. They reached the pass at Torre Miro by midday, a narrow defile between 2 towering cliffs. It was a natural choke point, the kind of place where a handful of men could hold off an army. Alvar ordered a detachment to remain and fortify the position. They would build a palisade, dig a ditch, and keep watch day and night. The GoodKnight watched as the soldiers set to work. They moved with the efficiency of veterans, felling trees and sharpening stakes. Within hours, the pass would be impassable to anything larger than a scouting party. Alvar rode up beside him. 1 down, 2 to go. The GoodKnight nodded. They remounted and continued east toward the pass at Querol. The terrain grew rougher, the trail narrowing to a ledge that hugged the side of a cliff. To the left, the ground dropped away into a ravine so deep the GoodKnight couldn't see the bottom. To the right, the cliff face rose sheer and unbroken. One misstep, and horse and rider would plunge into the abyss. The GoodKnight's destrier moved carefully, its hooves finding purchase on the icy stone. The GoodKnight kept his weight centered, his breathing steady. Fear was useless here. Fear made you tense, made you second-guess, made you fall. He had learned that long ago. They reached Carol by late afternoon. This pass was wider, less defensible, but Alvar had a plan. He ordered the cavalry to fell trees across the road, creating a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't stop a determined force, but it would slow them down, give the defenders time to send word to the main camp. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, they turned south, heading for the valley approach from Alcañiz. This was the most dangerous route, a broad, open valley that offered little cover. If the Almoravids were going to send a relief force, this was the way they would come. The GoodKnight felt the tension in the air. The men were quiet, their hands resting on their weapons. The horses sensed it too, their ears flicking nervously. And then, as they crested a low rise, they saw them. Riders. A dozen, maybe more, moving fast along the valley floor. The GoodKnight's hand went to his sword, but Alvar raised a fist, signaling the company to halt. "Scouts," Alvar said quietly. "Almoravid, by the look of them." The GoodKnight studied the distant figures. They wore light armor, carried bows and curved swords. Chinetas, fast, mobile skirmishers. They hadn't seen the Scythian cavalry yet, but they would soon. Alvar made a decision. "We take them, fast and hard, no survivors." The company spread out into a line, lances lowered. The GoodKnight drew his sword, a long, straight blade of Frankish steel. He preferred it to the lance in close combat. The lance was for the charge, the initial shock. The sword was for the killing that came after. Alvar gave the signal, and they spurred forward. The Almoravid scouts saw them coming and scattered, but they were too slow. The Scythian cavalry crashed into them like a hammer, the Kerskam. GoodKnight's destrier slammed into a smaller horse, sending it sprawling. The rider hit the ground hard, and the GoodKnight was on him in an instant, his sword coming down in a brutal arc. The blade bit through the scout's shoulder, and the man screamed, a high, keening sound that was cut short as the GoodKnight struck again. Around him, the battle was a chaos of noise and motion. Horses screaming, men shouting, the clash of steel on steel. The GoodKnight moved through it with a cold, mechanical precision. Block, strike, turn, strike again. His silver armor was splattered with blood, but none of it was his. It was over in minutes. The Almoravid scouts lay dead or dying in the dirt. The Scythian cavalry regrouped, breathing hard, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. Alvar rode over, his face grim. "Search them! See if they're carrying messages." The soldiers dismounted and began rifling through the bodies. The GoodKnight stayed in the saddle, his eyes scanning the valley. The scouts had been heading south, toward Morella. That meant the garrison knew the siege was coming. It also meant they might have sent word to Zaragoza, calling for reinforcements. One of the soldiers held up a leather pouch. "Captain, found something." Alvar took the pouch and opened it. Inside was a rolled parchment, sealed with wax. He broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening. "It's a dispatch to the governor of Morella," he said. "From the Almoravid commander in Zaragoza. They're promising reinforcements within the month." The GoodKnight felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A month. That meant El Cid had a month to take Morella before the Almoravids arrived with a relief force. A month to starve the garrison or storm the walls. Alvar looked at this GoodKnight. "We ride back. The Campeador needs to see this." They rode through the night, pushing the horses hard. By the time they reached the siege camp, the stars were out, cold and distant. The camp was quiet, most of the men asleep in their tents. But El Cid's pavilion was still lit, a warm glow against the darkness. Alva dismounted and strode inside. The GoodKnight followed. El Cid was alone, sitting at the table with a cup of wine. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp despite the late hour. Alva handed him the dispatch. "We intercepted Almoravid scouts in the valley. They were carrying this." El Cid read the parchment in silence. When he finished, he set it down and took a long drink of wine. "A month," he said quietly. "They think they have a month." Alva nodded. "We can fortify the passes, slow them down. But if they come in force?" "They won't," El Cid interrupted, "because Morella will have fallen by then." The GoodKnight saw the determination in the Campeador's eyes. This was not a man who would wait for starvation to do the work. This was a man who would take the fortress by force, no matter the cost. El Cid stood, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "We begin the assault in 3 days. Tell the engineers to prepare the siege engines. Tell the captains to ready their men." He looked at the GoodKnight. "And tell the knights to sharpen their swords. We're going to need them." The GoodKnight nodded. He had known it would come to this. It always did. 3 days. 3 days to prepare for the climb. 3 days before the killing began. Chapter 3. The Engines of War. The siege camp transformed over the next 3 days. What had been an orderly military encampment became a sprawling workshop of war. The sound of hammers on wood echoed across the plateau from dawn until long after dark. The smell of cut timber and hot pitch filled the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. The GoodKnight watched the engineers at work with a kind of detached fascination. These men were not warriors in the traditional sense. They did not charge into battle with swords raised or plant banners on conquered walls. But they were essential. Without them, fortresses like Morella would remain unconquerable, stone monuments to the futility of ambition. The chief engineer was a grizzled Catalan named Bernat, a man who had learned his trade building siege works for the Count of Barcelona before that lord had been humiliated by El Cid at Cabra. Bernat bore no grudge. He was a professional, and professionals followed the money and the victories. El Cid paid well and won often. That was enough. The GoodKnight found Bernat supervising the construction of a traction trebuchet on the eastern edge of the camp. The machine was massive, a wooden frame 20 feet tall, with a long throwing arm counterbalanced by ropes that would be pulled by teams of men. It was primitive compared to the great counterweight trebuchets that were beginning to appear in the Holy Land, but it was effective. And more importantly, it could be built quickly with the materials at hand. "GoodKnight," Bernat said, not looking up from the beam he was inspecting. "Come to admire my work?" "Come to understand it," the GoodKnight replied. Bernat grunted. "Not much to understand. You pull the ropes, the arm swings, the stone flies. If God wills it, the stone hits something important. If not, you load another stone and try again." "And the walls of Morella?" Bernat finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at the distant fortress. "The walls are the least of our problems. The lower town, the Albacar, has walls we can hit. Stone and mortar may be 10 feet high in places. We can crack those, given time. But the citadel—" He shook his head. "The citadel sits on solid rock. The cliffs are the walls. You can't knock down a mountain, GoodKnight." "Then what's the point of the engines?" "Terror," Bernat said simply. "We lob stones into the lower town, smash houses, kill civilians, make the garrison understand that we're serious. We make them afraid. Fear is a weapon, same as a sword. Maybe better, because fear spreads." The GoodKnight thought about that. He had seen fear on the battlefield, the moment when a formation broke, when discipline gave way to panic, when men threw down their weapons and ran. Fear was indeed a weapon. but it was also unpredictable. Sometimes it made men surrender. Sometimes it made them fight harder, with the desperation of the doomed. He watched as a team of soldiers hauled a massive stone into position, a rough-hewn boulder the size of a man's torso. It had been quarried from the surrounding hills, shaped just enough to fit into the trebuchet's sling. When the machine fired, that stone would arc through the air and come down with the force of God's own hammer. "How many can you build?" the GoodKnight asked. 3, maybe 4, if we work through the nights, Bernat said. "But we're limited by timber. This isn't the coast, GoodKnight. Trees up here are stunted, twisted. We're using what we can scavenge, but it's not ideal." "Will it be enough?" Bernat shrugged. "Enough to soften them up. Enough to make the assault possible. But taking Morella, that's going to come down to men with swords and the will to climb. No engine can do that for you." The GoodKnight nodded. He had known that already, but hearing it confirmed made it real. The trebuchets, the ballistae, the siege towers, they were all just tools to get the infantry to the walls. The real work, the bloody work, would be done by men like him. That night, the GoodKnight sat alone outside his tent, cleaning his armor. It was a ritual he performed every evening, a meditation as much as a practical necessity. He worked methodically, using a cloth and a mixture of vinegar and sand to scrub away the rust and grime. The silver mail gleamed in the firelight, each ring interlocking with its neighbors in a pattern that had been forged by a master armorer in Toledo years ago. The armor was more than protection. It was identity. When men saw the Silver Knight, they knew who he was, or at least they thought they did. They saw a warrior blessed by fortune, a man who walked through battles unscathed. They didn't see the scars beneath the mail, the aching joints, the nights when sleep wouldn't come because the faces of the dead crowded too close. A shadow fell across him. The GoodKnight looked up to see Pero Bermudez, El Cid's standard-bearer. Pero was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He carried the Campeador's banner into every battle, a position of honor and extreme danger. The enemy always targeted the standard-bearer, trying to bring down the banner and break the army's morale. "Mind if I sit?" Pero asked. The GoodKnight gestured to the ground beside him. Pero lowered himself with a grunt, his armor creaking. "Hell of a fortress," Pero said, nodding toward Morella. The mola was a black's silhouette against the starlit sky, the torches of the garrison flickering like distant fireflies. "Yes," the GoodKnight agreed. "You think we can take it?" The GoodKnight considered the question. "El Cid thinks we can. That's what matters." Pero laughed, a low rumble. "Aye, that's the truth. The Campeador says jump. We ask how high." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But between you and me, GoodKnight, I've got a bad feeling about this one. That rock, it's not natural. It's like God put it there to test us." "Maybe he did. And maybe we're fools for taking the test." Pero shook his head. "I've been with Rodrigo for 15 years. I've seen him do impossible things. But this? Storming a vertical fortress in the middle of winter with a relief army on the way? This feels different." The GoodKnight didn't disagree, but he also knew that doubt was a luxury they couldn't afford. "We've done impossible things before." "Aye, and we've lost good men doing them." Pero's voice was quiet now, almost reflective. "You hear about Diego?" "I heard. He was a good lad. Brave. Maybe too brave. Charged right into the Almoravid cavalry at Consuegra, trying to prove he was his father's son." Pero's jaw tightened. "Got himself killed for it. And now the Campeador has no heir, no son to carry on the name." The GoodKnight said nothing. What was there to say? Death was the constant companion of soldiers. It didn't matter if you were a prince or a common spearman. The sword didn't care about your bloodline. You ever think about what happens after? Pero asked suddenly. After what? After all this? After the wars? After El Cid is gone and we're too old to fight? What happens to men like us? The good knight looked at his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen from years of gripping sword hilts and reins. We die, he said simply. Same as everyone else. Pero laughed again, but there was no humor in it. I suppose we do. He stood, brushing the dirt from his breeches. Get some sleep, good knight. We're going to need it. The good knight watched him walk away, disappearing into the maze of tents. Then he returned to his armor, polishing each ring until it shone. Chapter 4. For the bombardment, the trebuchets began firing at dawn on the fourth day. The good knight was awake to hear the first shot, a deep, resonant thunk as the throwing arm released, followed by a whistling sound as the stone arced through the air. He stepped out of his tent in time to see the boulder descend, a dark speck against the grey sky, and then the impact. Even from a distance, he could hear the crash as the stone smashed into the lower town of Morella, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. A cheer went up from the Sidian camp. The engineers had found their range. Over the next hour, the other trebuchets joined in. The bombardment was methodical, almost rhythmic. Every few minutes, another stone would fly, and another section of the Albacar would shudder under the impact. The good knight watched from the edge of the camp, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He knew what was happening down there. The stones were smashing through roofs, collapsing walls, crushing anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. The civilians, the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, the families who had lived in Morella for generations, were huddling in cellars and praying to Allah for deliverance. The garrison soldiers were scrambling to reinforce the walls, to clear the rubble, to maintain some semblance of order. It was brutal. It was necessary. It was war. By midday, the lower town was a ruin. Smoke rose from a dozen fires where the stones had struck forges and kitchens. The good knight could see tiny figures moving through the streets, trying to fight the flames, trying to rescue the wounded. He felt nothing. He had learned long ago to separate himself from the suffering of strangers. Pity was a weakness. Pity got you killed. But then something changed. One of the stones struck the wall near the main gate, and instead of bouncing off or embedding itself in the stone, it punched through. The wall crumbled, a section maybe 10 feet wide collapsing into rubble. The good knight saw it happen, saw the gap open up like a wound, and he saw the Almoravid soldiers rush to fill it. They came pouring out of the side streets, dozens of them, carrying timber and stones to plug the breach. They worked with frantic energy, knowing that the gap was an invitation to the besiegers. If the Sidian army stormed the breach now, the lower town would fall, within hours. But El Cid was not ready. Not yet. The assault was planned for tomorrow, after the bombardment had done its full work. Storming the breach now would be premature, would waste the advantage of preparation. So the good knight watched as the Almoravids rebuilt the wall, stone by stone, timber by timber, and he watched as the trebuchets continued to fire, trying to knock it down again. It was a grim, grinding contest. Destruction and reconstruction over and over until one side or the other broke. That evening, El Cid called another war council. The captains gathered in the command tent, their faces lit by the glow of oil lamps. The good knight stood in his usual place at the back, silent and observant. El Cid looked tired. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his voice was hoarse, but his gaze was as sharp as ever. "The bombardment has done its work," he said without preamble. "The lower town is in ruins. The garrison is demoralized. Tomorrow we storm the walls." There was a murmur of agreement from the captains. This was what they had been waiting for. "The plan is simple," El Cid continued. "We hit them from two directions. Alvar, you'll take the heavy cavalry and the Aragonese infantry. You'll attack the northern approach, draw their attention, make them think that's the main assault." Alvar nodded. "A feint." "Exactly. While they're focused on you, Pero and I will lead the main assault on the southern gate. We'll use the breach the trebuchets opened. The infantry will go in first, shields up, clear the gatehouse. Once we're inside the Albacar, the cavalry will follow and will push up toward the middle ward." One of the Aragonese lords raised a hand. "And the citadel?" El Cid's expression hardened. "The citadel is the final objective, but we take it one step at a time. First the Albacar, then the middle ward, then the summit. We don't rush. We don't break formation. We grind them down, level by level." The GoodKnight listened, committing the plan to memory. It was sound as far as siege tactics went. But he also knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy. Once the fighting started, it would devolve into chaos. The key was to stay focused, to keep moving forward no matter what. "Good night," El Cid said, and the tent fell silent. "You'll be with the forlorn hope." The GoodKnight felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The forlorn hope. The first wave. The men who would charge the breach, who would take the brunt of the defenders' fury. It was a position of honor. It was also a death sentence for most who accepted it. But the GoodKnight simply nodded. "Yes, my lord." El Cid's gaze held his for a moment, and the GoodKnight thought he saw something there. Respect, perhaps, or pity. Then the Campeador looked away. "Get some rest," El Cid said to the assembled captains. "Tomorrow, we take Morella." The GoodKnight did not sleep that night. He sat outside his tent, his sword across his knees, and watched the stars wheel overhead. The camp was quiet, the soldiers huddled in their tents against the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that echoed through the mountains. The GoodKnight thought about the men who would die tomorrow. He thought about the breach, the narrow gap in the wall where the defenders would be waiting with spears and swords and boiling oil. He thought about the climb, the endless, brutal climb up the mola, fighting for every step. And he thought about Diego Rodriguez, the young prince who had died at Consuegra, trying to prove himself. The GoodKnight wondered if Diego had been afraid in those final moments, or if he had been too caught up in the glory of the charge to feel fear. The GoodKnight was not afraid. Fear required imagination, the ability to picture a future where you didn't exist. The GoodKnight had long since stopped imagining futures. There was only the present, the weight of the sword, the cold of the night, the certainty of the dawn. He stood as the first light touched the eastern horizon. Around him, the camp was stirring. Soldiers emerged from their tents, yawning and stretching, checking their weapons and armor. The smell of cooking fires filled the air. Porridge and salted pork, the meager breakfast of an army on campaign. The GoodKnight donned his armor piece by piece. The mail hauberk, heavy and familiar. The coif to protect his head and neck. The conical helmet with its nasal guard. The kite shield, painted with a simple cross. And finally, the sword, belted at his waist. He was ready. The forlorn hope assembled near the command tent. There were 50 of them, knights and veteran infantry, men who had volunteered or been chosen for their skill and courage. They stood in silence, their faces grim. They knew what was coming. Pero Bermudez walked among them, checking armor, offering quiet words of encouragement. When he reached the GoodKnight, he paused. "You don't have to do this," Pero said quietly. "You've earned the right to stay back. Let the younger men take the risk." The GoodKnight shook his head. "This is where I belong." Pero studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Aye, I suppose it is." He clapped the GoodKnight on the shoulder. "God be with you, friend." "And with you." El Cid emerged from his tent, fully armored, his sword at his side. He looked at the assembled forlorn hope, his gaze sweeping over each man. "You are the tip of the spear," he said, his voice carrying across the silent camp. "You are the first into the breach, the first to face the enemy. What you do today will be remembered. Your courage will inspire the men who follow. Your sacrifice will not be in vain." He drew his sword, the blade catching the morning light. "For Valencia! For Castile! For glory!" The forlorn hope roared in response, a primal sound that echoed across the plateau. And then they were moving, marching toward the mola, toward the breach, toward the killing ground. The GoodKnight marched with them, his silver armor gleaming, his heart steady. The storm was about to break. Chapter 5. The Breach, the approach to Morella, was a descent into hell. The GoodKnight moved with the forlorn hope down the rocky slope toward the lower town. The path was narrow, winding between boulders and stunted trees, and it forced the column into a single file. Above them, the walls of the Albacar loomed, and the GoodKnight could see the defenders lining the ramparts, dark figures silhouetted against the grey sky, their bows and spears ready. The bombardment had stopped. The trebuchets sat silent on the plateau behind them, their work done. Now it was up to the infantry. The GoodKnight's breath came steady and even, despite the weight of his armor. His shield was strapped to his left arm, his sword sheathed at his side. In his right hand he carried a heavy mace, better for close quarters fighting in the confined space of a breach. The mace could crush bone through mail, could shatter helmets and skulls with a single blow. Ahead, the breach was visible. A ragged gap in the yarn, wall where the trebuchet stones had done their work. The Almoravids had tried to repair it, piling rubble and timber into the opening, but it was a hasty job. The GoodKnight could see the gaps, the weak points where a determined push could break through. But first, they had to reach it. The Almoravid archers opened fire when the forlorn hope was still 100 yards from the wall. The air filled with the whistle of arrows, and the GoodKnight raised his shield instinctively. The arrows came down like rain. Thunk, 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 embedding themselves in wood and earth, and occasionally flesh. A man behind the GoodKnight screamed as an arrow punched through his thigh. Another took a shaft in the shoulder and stumbled, falling to his knees. "Shields up! Keep moving!" Pero Bermudez's voice boomed over the chaos. The standard-bearer was at the front of the column. El Cid's banner held high, a red and gold target that drew every enemy eye. The GoodKnight kept his shield raised and his head down. The arrows were a constant threat, but they were also a distraction. The real danger would come when they reached the breach. That was where the Almoravids would make their stand. The column reached the base of the wall. Here, the ground was littered with rubble from the bombardment, broken stones, shattered timber, the occasional body half buried in the debris. The smell was overwhelming, dust and smoke, and the sickly sweet stench of death. The breach was directly ahead, a dark opening in the wall. The GoodKnight could see movement inside. Almoravid soldiers waiting in the shadows, their spears leveled, their shields locked. Pero raised his sword. "Forlorn hope! With me!" And then they were charging. The GoodKnight ran, his armor clanking, his boots slipping on the loose stones. Around him, the other soldiers roared, a wordless battle cry meant to drown out fear. The distance to the breach closed, 50 yards, 30, 10, and then they hit. The impact was like running into a wall. The Almoravid shield wall held, and the first rank of the forlorn hope crashed against it with bone-jarring force. The GoodKnight's shield slammed into an enemy shield, and he felt the shock run up his arm. He pushed, using his weight and strength to drive the defender back, and swung his mace in a brutal arc. The weapon connected with a helmet, and the Almoravid soldier dropped like a stone. But there were more. Always more. The fighting in the breach was savage and claustrophobic. There was no room to maneuver, no space for tactics. It was simply a matter of pushing forward, of killing the man in front of you, and then the next, and the next. The GoodKnight fought with mechanical precision, his mace rising and falling, his shield blocking and shoving. Blood sprayed across his armor, hot and sticky. The screams of the wounded and dying filled his ears. A spear thrust at his face, and he twisted, the point scraping across his helmet with a screech of metal on metal. He grabbed the spear shaft with his shield hand and yanked, pulling the wielder off balance. His mace came down on the man's shoulder, and he heard the crack of breaking bone. Beside him, a Scythian soldier went down, his throat opened by an Almoravid sword. The GoodKnight stepped over the body and kept moving. There was no time to mourn, no time for anything but the fight. Inch by inch, the forlorn hope pushed into the breach. The Almoravid defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that if the breach fell, the lower town would follow. But they were outnumbered, and the Scythian soldiers were veterans, hardened by years of war. Slowly, inevitably, the shield wall began to crack. The GoodKnight felt the moment it broke. The pressure against his shield suddenly eased, and the Almoravid line fragmented. The defenders fell back, retreating into the narrow streets of the Albaca, and the forlorn hope surged forward. "Hold the breach!" Perro's voice cut through the din. "Secure the gatehouse!" The GoodKnight turned toward the gatehouse, a squat stone structure that controlled the main gate. A handful of Almoravid soldiers had barricaded themselves inside, and they were firing arrows through the narrow windows. The GoodKnight joined a group of infantry as they rushed the door. It was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and it didn't budge when they hit it. "Axes!" someone shouted. Two soldiers with heavy axes stepped forward and began hacking at the door. The wood splintered under the blows, and after a dozen strikes, the door gave way. The GoodKnight was the first through, his mace raised. The interior of the gatehouse was dark and cramped. The Almoravid defenders were waiting, and they fought like cornered animals. The GoodKnight blocked a sword strike with his shield and countered with his mace, crushing the attacker's ribs. Another defender lunged at him with a dagger, and the GoodKnight caught the man's wrist, twisted, and drove his knee into the man's stomach. The defender doubled over, and the GoodKnight's mace ended it. Within minutes, the gatehouse was secured. The Scythian soldiers threw open the main gate, and the rest of the army poured through, infantry, cavalry, siege engineers, all flooding into the Albaca like a tide. The GoodKnight stepped out of the gatehouse and surveyed the scene. The lower town was in chaos. Almoravid soldiers were retreating up the narrow streets toward the middle ward, fighting a desperate rearguard action. Scythian troops were spreading through the Albaca, clearing houses, hunting down stragglers. Fires were burning, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Pero Bermudez appeared at the GoodKnight's side, his armor drenched in blood, his face flushed with exertion. "We did it," he said, breathing hard. "We're in." The GoodKnight nodded, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Albaca was the lowest level of Morella. Above them, the middle ward and the citadel still stood, and the defenders would make them pay for every step. El Cid rode through the gate on his warhorse, his sword drawn, his eyes blazing. He looked at the burning town, at the bodies littering the streets, and his expression was cold. "Push forward," he commanded. "Don't give them time to regroup. We take the middle ward before nightfall." The army surged forward, and the GoodKnight went with them, climbing toward the heart of the Mola. Chapter 6. The Vertical War. The streets of Morella were not streets in any conventional sense. They were steep, winding passages carved into the limestone, more like staircases than roads. The GoodKnight climbed with the rest of the assault force, his legs burning, his lungs aching in the thin air. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. The Almoravid defenders had fallen back to the middle ward, and they were making the Scythian army pay for every yard. Archers fired from the rooftops, their arrows clattering off shields and armor. Soldiers hurled stones and roof tiles from upper windows, and the GoodKnight had to keep his shield raised constantly, his neck and shoulders screaming with the strain. The fighting was house to house, room to room. The Scythian infantry would kick down a door, and the Almoravids would be waiting inside with swords and spears. The GoodKnight lost count of the skirmishes, the brief, brutal melees in cramped spaces where there was no room to swing a sword properly, where men grappled and stabbed and choked each other in the darkness. He fought his way through a narrow alley, his mace smashing through a wooden door. Inside, 3 Almoravid soldiers turned to face him. The GoodKnight didn't hesitate. He charged, his shield slamming into the nearest man, driving him back into the wall. His mace came down on another's head, and the man crumpled. The 3rd soldier swung a scimitar, and the GoodKnight caught the blade on his shield, the impact jarring his arm. He stepped inside the man's guard and drove the pommel of his mace into the soldier's face. Bone crunched, and the man fell. The GoodKnight stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, his armor slick with blood. Around him, the sounds of battle echoed, shouts, screams, the clash of steel. He moved to the window and looked out. The middle ward was a maze of tiered streets and stone houses, all clinging to the slope of the mola. Above, the citadel loomed, its walls rising sheer from the rock. The GoodKnight could see the Almoravid banner flying from the highest tower, a green field with white script, the words of the Shahada proclaiming the oneness of God. That banner would fall. The GoodKnight knew it with a cold certainty. El Cid did not accept defeat. He would take the citadel, no matter how many men it cost. A shout from the street below pulled the GoodKnight's attention. He looked down to see Alvar Fanez leading a group of cavalry up the main thoroughfare. The horses were struggling on the steep incline, their hooves slipping on the cobblestones, but Alvar drove them forward with relentless determination. The GoodKnight left the house and rejoined the assault. The Scythian forces were converging on the central plaza of the middle ward, a small open space dominated by a stone fountain. The Almoravids had fortified the plaza, erecting barricades of timber and overturned carts. Behind the barricades, a solid line of spearmen waited, their shields locked, their faces grim. El Cid was already there, dismounted, his sword in hand. He looked at the barricades, at the defenders, and then at his captains. "We break them here," he said. "Alvar, take your cavalry around the left flank. Pero, you're with me. We hit them head-on." The GoodKnight fell in with Pero's group. They formed up in a tight column, shields overlapping, and then they charged. The Almoravid spearmen braced for impact. The GoodKnight saw the spear points leveled at him, saw the determination in the defenders' eyes, and then the 2 lines collided. The shock of impact nearly knocked the GoodKnight off his feet. A spear thrust at his chest, and he deflected it with his shield, the point scraping across the wood. He swung his mace, and the weapon smashed into a shield, splintering the wood. Another swing, and he felt the satisfying crunch of bone. The fighting was brutal and exhausting. The Almoravids gave ground slowly, contesting every inch. But the Scythian forces were relentless, and when Alvar's cavalry hit the flank, the Almoravid line finally broke. The defenders fled up the slope toward the citadel, and the Scythian soldiers pursued, cutting down the stragglers. The GoodKnight stopped in the center of the plaza, his chest heaving, his armor dented and blood-stained. The middle ward had fallen, but the citadel remained. El Cid called a halt as the sun began to set. The army was exhausted, and the climb to the citadel would be the most difficult yet. The path was narrow and exposed, winding up the final slope of the molar like a serpent. The defenders would have every advantage: height, cover, and desperation. The good knight sat on the edge of the fountain in the plaza, his helmet off, his head bowed. Around him, soldiers tended to their wounds, drank from water skins, and tried to catch their breath. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood. Pero Bermudez approached, limping slightly. He had taken a spear thrust to the thigh, and though the wound had been bandaged, blood was seeping through the cloth. "You should rest," the good knight said. Pero shook his head. "I'll rest when we're done." He sat down beside the good knight with a grunt. "Hell of a day." "Yes. You think we can take the citadel?" The good knight looked up at the fortress. The walls were lit by torches, and he could see the Pascuan, defenders moving along the ramparts. "We'll take it." "You sound certain." "El Cid is certain." "That's enough." Pero laughed, a tired sound. "You have more faith than I do, friend." The good knight didn't reply. Faith had nothing to do with it. It was simply a matter of will. El Cid's will against the will of the Almoravid garrison, and the good knight had never seen the Campeador's will broken. Chapter 7. The Summit. The assault on the citadel began at dawn. The good knight stood at the base of the final ascent, looking up at the path that wound toward the summit. It was barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, and it was lined with sheer drops on one side and the fortress wall on the other. The defenders had piled stones and timber along the path, creating makeshift barricades, and archers were positioned at every turn. This was the killing ground, the place where the Almoravids would make their last stand. El Cid addressed the assault force, 200 men, the best and bravest of the mesnada. The good knight was among them, his armor battered but still intact, his mace heavy in his hand. "This is the end," El Cid said, his voice carrying over the assembled soldiers. "Beyond that gate is the citadel. Beyond the citadel is victory. We have come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. Today we plant our banner on the highest tower of Morella. Today we show the Almoravids that there is no fortress in Spain they can hold against us." He drew his sword and pointed it at the citadel. "Forward, for Valencia!" The assault force roared and began the climb. The good knight moved with them, his shield raised, his eyes on the path ahead. The first barricade was 50 yards up, and the Almoravid archers opened fire as soon as the Scythian soldiers came into range. Arrows whistled through the air, and men fell, tumbling off the path and plunging into the ravine below. The good knight kept his shield high and his head down. An arrow struck his shield with a thunk, the point punching through the wood but not reaching his arm. Another arrow glanced off his helmet, the impact ringing in his ears. The column reached the first barricade. It was a crude affair, overturned carts and piled stones, but it blocked the path. The Scythian soldiers attacked it with axes and crowbars, tearing it apart, while the archers above continued to fire. The good knight helped drag a cart aside, and then the path was clear. The column surged forward, climbing higher. The second barricade was more formidable. The Almoravids had built a wooden palisade across the path, and behind it a line of spearmen waited. The good knight was in the front rank when they hit the palisade, and he felt the impact shudder through his body. The spears thrust through the gaps in the wood, and the good knight had to twist and dodge to avoid being skewered. He swung his mace at the palisade, and the wood splintered. Other soldiers joined him, hacking and smashing, and slowly the palisade gave way. The Almoravid spearmen fell back, and the Scythian soldiers poured through. The fighting on the narrow path was desperate. There was no room to maneuver, no space to retreat. The good knight fought shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, his mace rising and falling, his shield blocking and shoving. Men screamed and died, and their bodies were pushed off the path to make room for the living. The good knight's world narrowed to the man in front of him. an Almoravid soldier with a scarred face and a notched sword. They traded blows, the GoodKnight's mace against the soldier's blade, and then the GoodKnight's shield slammed into the man's chest, driving him back. The soldier stumbled, his foot slipping on the edge of the path, and then he was gone, falling into the void with a scream that was cut short by the impact below. The GoodKnight didn't watch him fall. He was already moving forward, climbing higher. The path opened onto a small courtyard in front of the citadel gate. The gate was massive, iron-bound oak set into the stone wall. Above it, the defenders had gathered, and they were raining down everything they had: arrows, stones, boiling oil. The GoodKnight raised his shield as a pot of oil shattered on the ground beside him, the liquid splashing across the stones. A soldier nearby wasn't so lucky. The oil caught him full in the face, and he screamed, clawing at his eyes. El Cid was at the front, his sword raised, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Bring up the ram!" A team of soldiers hauled a massive log forward, a crude battering ram, its head wrapped in iron. They positioned it in front of the gate and began to swing. Boom, boom, boom. The gate shuddered with each impact. The defenders above redoubled their efforts, and the courtyard became a hellscape of fire and blood. The GoodKnight stood with the others, his shield raised, protecting the ram crew as they worked. Boom, boom, boom. The gate cracked. The iron bands bent. And then, with a final splintering crash, it gave way. The Scythian soldiers poured through the gate, into the citadel. The GoodKnight was among the first, his mace ready, his eyes scanning for threats. The interior of the citadel was a maze of narrow corridors and stone chambers. The Almoravid defenders fought room by room, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. The GoodKnight moved through the fortress like a force of nature, his mace crushing skulls and shattering bones. He climbed a spiral staircase, his boots slipping on the blood-slick stones. At the top he emerged onto the ramparts. The wind hit him like a fist, cold and fierce, and he had to brace himself to keep from being blown off the wall. The highest tower was ahead, and the Almoravid banner still flew from its peak. A handful of defenders stood at the base of the tower, their swords drawn, their faces set with grim determination. The GoodKnight advanced. The defenders charged, and he met them head-on. His mace swung in brutal arcs, and one by one, the defenders fell. The last man standing was an officer, his armor finer than the others, his sword gleaming. He fought with skill and courage, but he was no match for the GoodKnight's relentless assault. The mace came down on his shoulder, and the officer dropped to his knees. The GoodKnight's next blow ended it. The GoodKnight stood alone on the ramparts, breathing hard, his armor drenched in blood. He looked up at the tower, at the Almoravid banner snapping in the wind. And then Pero Bermudez was there, limping but alive, El Cid's banner in his hands. He climbed the tower, and with a final triumphant shout, he tore down the Almoravid flag and raised the banner of El Cid. The Scythian soldiers below roared, a sound of victory that echoed across the mountains. Morella had fallen. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The GoodKnight stood on the highest point of the citadel, looking south toward Valencia. The city was invisible from this distance, hidden beyond the coastal hills. But he knew it was there. The city they had fought to protect. The city that El Cid had carved out of the chaos of the Reconquista. The wind was cold, and the GoodKnight's armor was heavy, but he didn't move. He stood and watched the sun set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Behind him, the citadel was being secured. The surviving Almoravid defenders had been rounded up, disarmed, and locked in the lower chambers. The Scythian soldiers were looting the fortress, searching for food, weapons, anything of value. The wounded were being tended to, and the dead were being counted. The cost had been high. Nearly a third of the assault force had been killed or wounded. The good knight had seen good men die, men he had fought beside for years. But they had won. They had taken the key to the Diaz north. They had secured the corridor to Aragon. They had proven, once again, that El Cid was unstoppable. Pero Bermudez approached, his limp more pronounced now. He stood beside the good knight, looking out at the darkening landscape. "We did it," Pero said quietly. "Yes." "Was it worth it?" The good knight considered the question. Was it worth it? The lives lost, the blood spilled, the suffering inflicted? He thought about Diego Rodriguez, the young prince who had died at Consuegra. He thought about the civilians in the Albaca, crushed by trebuchet stones. He thought about the Almoravid soldiers who had fought with courage and died defending their fortress. "I don't know," the good knight said finally. Pero nodded. "Neither do I." They stood in silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. El Cid held a council that night in the citadel's great hall. The captains gathered around a long table, their faces lit by the glow of torches. The good knight stood at the back, as always, silent and observant. "We've taken Morella," El Cid said, his voice hoarse but strong. "But the war is not over. The Almoravids will send a relief force. We need to be ready." Alvar Fañez leaned forward. "The passes are secure. We can hold them for a time. But if they come in force, then we'll meet them in the field." El Cid interrupted. "We've beaten them before. We'll beat them again." One of the Aragonese lords spoke up. "And what of Almenara? And Murviedro? You said those were the next objectives." El Cid nodded. "They are. With Morella in our hands, the northern frontier is secure. We can turn our attention to the coast, Almenara first, then Murviedro. By the end of next year, the entire Levant will be ours." The captains murmured their agreement. The good knight listened, and he felt a strange sense of detachment. The war would continue. There would be more sieges, more battles, more death. And he would be there, fighting, surviving, enduring. Because that was what he did. That was all he knew. The good knight left the hall and walked through the citadel. The fortress was quiet now, the sounds of battle replaced by the low murmur of soldiers settling in for the night. He climbed the stairs to the ramparts and stood where he had stood earlier, looking out at the darkness. The wind had died down, and the air was still. The stars were brilliant, cold points of light in the vast black sky. The good knight thought about the years he had spent in this endless war, the battles he had fought, the men he had killed, the friends he had lost. He thought about the future, the sieges yet to come, the enemies yet to face. He thought about El Cid, the man who had shaped his life, who had given him purpose and direction. And he thought about the day when the Campeador would finally fall, when the legend would end, and the kingdom would crumble. But that day was not today. Today they had won. They had taken Morella. They had secured the keys to the kingdom of Valencia. And the good knight had survived. He always did. The next morning, the good knight stood in the courtyard as the army prepared to march. Some would remain to garrison Morella, but the main force was moving south, back to Valencia, to rest and refit before the next campaign. El Cid rode past on his war-horse, and he paused when he saw the good knight. For a moment, their eyes met, and the Campeador nodded. A small gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. The good knight nodded back, and then El Cid rode on, and the army followed. The good knight mounted his destrier and joined the column. As they descended from the mola, he looked back one last time at the fortress. The banner of El Cid flew from the highest tower, snapping in the wind, a symbol of victory and dominance. Morella had fallen. The northern frontier was secure. The war would continue. and the good knight would march on, through the endless cycle of battle and blood, a silver-armored witness to the rise and fall of kingdoms. He had survived the siege of Morella. He would survive. What came next? He always did. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.